Hello everyone, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 10, Diversity LGBTQIA+. I'm here with my faithful sidekick. There she is, Asta, hanging out in her chair. We just went for a long walk, so chances are only 50-50 that she'll burst out barking during the middle of this presentation. So the latter part of the chapter, your authors start with talking about what we know as psychologists who do research on different kinds of relationship constellations. What's kind of the state of the knowledge about the nature of these relationships. Most research that we have out there before we kind of launch into the differences is about heterosexual couples. And for the most part, that research is either about cohabiting or married couples. And between those two groups, there's more research on married people. So you kind of get a sense that psychologists have been limited to studying what's perceived to be normative. We will talk later in this chapter about the concept of heteronormativity. That's certainly been the case in relationship research. But we do know some things about so-called mixed orientation relationships. And most of that has been research on people whose sexual orientation may be either gay, lesbian, bisexual, but they're married to an opposite sex partner. A lot of that research originated with looking specifically at gay men who were also married to women and had families with women, but maintained having relationships with men, either to the knowledge of their spouses or not. So some of that research has looked at what the motivations are. In many cases, in most cases, these were individuals who expressed deep affection, love, and commitment to their marriage partner, but and at the same time, maybe seeing that family connection to an opposite sex partner as a way to have children, and to do so in the traditional context of a heterosexual marriage. And certainly you should remember, most of this research was done prior to the big kind of changes in our culture, which have led to more and more countries and more states within the United States declaring same-sex marriage legal. So a lot of this research predates any of that, and trying to look at what people's motivations have been in the past. So in some cases, it's marrying in an opposite sex heterosexual context in order to have kind of a socially sanctioned family system. It's also very common for families to pressure people to marry, and to marry legally in that sense of having a heterosexual relationship. Many people feel a more broad pressure to have a lifestyle that other people approve of, or they may believe that marriage is the only way that you can kind of signify that you are now grown up, that you have a fully adult lifestyle. Obviously, those norms and expectations are changing. Over the last 20 years or so, we've certainly seen a dramatic shift in the percentage of Americans who approve of same-sex partnerships, that approve of having children when you're single, of having children when you're cohabiting, having children in a variety of contexts and ways that include multiple family constellations. So I would guess that over the next 10 to 15 years, we'll see a lot of changes in motivations for mixed orientation relationships, as well as the number of them that are detected when people research these issues. At the time when a lot of this research was conducted, and as I mentioned before, most of this research is focused on gay men who are married to women. It was estimated at the time that research was conducted that about 20% of gay men were at some point in time married to women or married to a woman. In mixed orientation relationships, one of the research topics that has occupied some researchers is how do you, if you are a person whose sexual orientation is gay, lesbian, or bisexual, how does that process of coming out to your partner work? What are the experiences of people who have that coming out experience? In some cases, couples will choose to maintain their marriage. The variety of ways in which that kind of rolls itself out is broad. In some cases, you have partners who agree that the individual who has a sexual orientation that is not consistent with their marriage partner, so in some cases there's an agreement that they can go outside of the relationship to meet sexual needs that are consistent with their sexual orientation. And sometimes those rules are consistent with what we saw in a previous chapter about swinging or open relationships, where you have, certain very specific guidelines for people to follow. In other cases, you have an agreement among the marriage partners that they will not go outside of that marriage. And in some cases, that's the thing that ends up severing the connection between the partners. So in some cases, what people report in research is that if these marriages persist, it's between people who have very open communication. They have other people to talk to. Perhaps they have engaged in relationship counseling or therapy, and have learned positive coping strategies associated with the issues that this poses for their relationship. And that can include, in some cases, other people outside the relationship knowing and or finding out and kind of imposing their own moral standards and beliefs and values onto the couple. Now, you also have to consider, if you're talking about a relationship where you have children, coming out to those children, whether or not your marriage persists, is something that has to be navigated. So some of the things that your authors talk about in terms of having a productive conversation with a child, if the way you've lived your life up until that time has suggested one orientation, but your actual orientation is something different, you have to kind of navigate based on the age of the child exactly how you want to have that conversation with that child. And what researchers have found is that people report either greater or lesser comfort that correlates with their own comfort with their own orientation. That probably shouldn't surprise you. If you're comfortable with your sexuality and you understand your own sexuality, it's easier for you to communicate that to other people, including those you love. When people are conflicted, when they are new to their own experience of their own sexual orientation, it can be confusing for them. And if you're in that space trying to communicate that to your kids can be hard. So in that case, some recommendations, you may need support and assistance from others in order to communicate effectively with your children. Your authors suggest discussing your orientation with children as young as you can, and being clear and transparent about it at an age-appropriate level. And also to have a frank conversation about what is okay or necessary or appropriate for them to communicate to other people. Let's say that you have a family where mom and dad have decided to divorce or dissolve their marriage. Dad has come out as gay and is dating men. The children in the family previously, they had seen their mom and dad together, assumed heterosexuality. They've had conversations with their children. Now the children need to navigate, depending on how old they are, how they want to present their dad to their friends who also saw him as heterosexual. So you can imagine that would be tricky, it would be challenging. Now, I've had people in my life who went through this in their families, where either mom or dad, they were in their teenage years when their parents split up, and one of the reasons they split up was because either mom or dad was finally going to move into a life where they were living their sexual orientation honestly. And it was very challenging for these families. It was hard on the spouse who was, it was hard on both spouses. It was particularly hard for the spouse who was heterosexual, who was losing that primary relationship with someone that they loved. And it was hard for the kids to kind of redefine and retool their way of conceptualizing their parents' relationship, but also the identities of their mothers and fathers separately. Research on homosexual and bisexual relationships, certainly there's been more research on homosexual relationships, particularly gay male relationships. So if you're going, back in time and looking historically, there's been more attention paid to gay male relationships, somewhat less, but it's caught up in recent years to lesbian relationships, and far less on bisexual relationships. So we can start by talking about what we know. One thing that it's often a stereotype that's hard to overcome. We often assume that gay and heterosexual relationships go into very, very separate silos and they look very different. But in fact, looking at the relationship satisfaction literature, at the relationship story literature, like people telling the stories of their relationships, or even just how they describe their everyday lives, there are far more similarities than there are differences between gay and lesbian, bisexual relationships and heterosexual couple relationships. So they're strikingly similar, as your authors put it. It has been noted that in terms of relationship satisfaction, lesbian couples tend to report the highest levels of relationship quality in terms of a variety of key variables. Satisfaction is one of those, just overall satisfaction with the relationship, their perception of equal valuing of their partner, their perception of the level of honesty and trust within their relationship, the quality of their sexual interactions, and so on. So overall, what research we have available to us shows that lesbian couples seem to be doing something right here. Gay and lesbian couples do tend to report somewhat more resiliency when their relationships are challenged. So when there are stressors within the relationship, when there are problems in the relationship, gay and lesbian couples tend to report being more able to bounce back from those and to preserve the quality of the relationship. Now, some researchers have speculated that this may be because gay and lesbian couples, the individuals within those couples, they have to fight adversity all the time, so they get really adept at it. So their resiliency skills may simply be sharper, and they're accustomed to having to navigate their relationships without sort of the backdrop of a scaffold of understandings that is supported by cultural beliefs about what relationships should look like. So they're kind of accustomed to DIYing their relationships and also bouncing back in the face of adversity. Now, as I mentioned earlier, gay male relationships have probably received more research attention than lesbian/female relationships and bisexual relationships. Part of this is because of just researchers' interests. Another part of it was kind of driven, not intentionally, but in some ways accidentally, by the advent of the AIDS crisis. The culture having to kind of face and deal with the onset of HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, it really sparked kind of a cascading of more interest in gay relationships. especially as the 80s rolled on and the early 90s hit. You had more and more celebrities who were willing to say out loud, you know, I'm a gay man. And that kind of kicked the doors open for more frank research and investigation about what are the lives of gay people really like. Because, you know, prior to that time, you had scant information about people's lives. So your authors talk about some common myths about gay male relationships. And one of the myths is that gay male relationships are always or overwhelmingly casual, kind of loveless, and involve a lot of kind of trolling for anonymous sex. In the most harsh versions of this stereotype, it means, you know, trolling bars, trolling bathrooms, and having casual pickups with people who are complete strangers. Now, relationship researchers, when they get down to talking to gay men about what they would prefer, they overwhelmingly, just like heterosexual people, prefer to have relationships that are committed and that are exclusive. So one of the ways that we have to think about this is if you ask gay men, you know, what kind of sexual experiences have you had? Gay men are significantly more likely to report having had more casual sexual encounters than other groups, such as lesbian women and heterosexual males and females. So how do you explain that? In part, as your authors put it, it's probably better explained by their maleness and the masculinity norms within American culture and within other cultures. So basically, casual sex is more permissible for men than women. So when you look at a finding like statistically, you see both gay men and heterosexual men report more casual sex than lesbian women and straight women. And you look at the endorsement level of masculinity. So both gay and straight men who endorse high belief in masculinity norms, they tend to report more casual sex. So it's probably better explained, as your authors put it, by the fact that they're male, and less so that they're gay. Another piece of the puzzle here is that in cultures, you know, up until the fairly recent past, and still in many places in the country, heterosexism and homophobia mean that it's harder, much harder, to have open sexual expression, like going down the street and holding hands, or being in restaurants and being openly affectionate with your partner. Up until the relatively recent past, that was simply something you weren't able to do if you were gay or lesbian. For gay men, in particular, the sort of pathologization of gay male sex meant that in many cases, finding partners was driven underground. Now, you shouldn't dismiss the fact that there is a part of gay male culture in the United States that is very consistent with the broader pickup culture that's evident. And we've talked about that in class in terms of recent generations. But you do need to think about that myth and put it into a broader context. So as your authors put it, both gay men and straight men there's greater acceptance of casual sex. There's greater acceptance of sex with acquaintances and even strangers. There's greater acceptance of hooking up and having sexual encounters that have very little kind of affection and intimacy to them. So that's simply more acceptable within our cultural context. Women face bigger barriers there, typically, although in your generation that's starting to change. As your authors put it, in this research, you should acknowledge that if you look at the dates in your textbook of when this research was primarily conducted, a lot of it is survey research that's about 10 years old. So I would look to, you know, that research being updated within the next 5 or 10 years and seeing some changes in those numbers. But basically, the authors of some of this research talk about the idea that for men in highly gender segregated cultures where masculinity is clearly defined as different from femininity, you do see this sex first formula. So the way males on average talk about relationships is they're serious when sex is first, intimacy comes last or comes later. Still though, as I mentioned before, gay men report when researchers bother to ask them, which would you prefer? A lot of serial hookups or a long-term loving relationship? And in numbers consistent with straight men, they report preferring long-term, committed, affectionate, intimate relationships. Sex outside of the primary relationship has been reported by researchers to be at low levels. And when it happens, it's reported to not include a lot of emotional involvement. Now, where this research is coming from is, when you find researchers who actually look at committed gay male relationships, which there's not enough of that research, but when it has happened and they ask about pursuing sex outside of that primary relationship, what kind of sex is it? Is it an emotional affair that happens to involve sex, or is it a hookup? And what they've reported is that most of the time it doesn't involve an emotional affair, it involves a hookup. In some relationships, that's sort of an accepted practice, but not in most. Now, caveat, asterisk, we don't have as much data as would be desirable about those findings. And as I've said before, I expect in the next 5 to 10 years that our understanding will improve. Now, lesbian relationships, as I've said before, we have more information about gay male relationships, a little less about lesbian relationships. And in recent years, we've seen research increasing pretty steadily on this topic. In attitude research and in interview studies, most lesbian women report that what they want, what they value, they want stable, monogamous, exclusive relationships. They want those relationships to be intimate, to be emotionally rewarding, but also sexually satisfying. One of the stereotypes about lesbian relationships is that they are sexless, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. That stereotype is based on the idea that sex doesn't happen unless there's a penis involved. So that stereotype is certainly not the case. It just shows a great deal of ignorance of how lesbian women navigate their sexual relationships. What these women also report, they tend to report that they have greater skill and greater efficacy in their sexual lives, meaning that these are women who have spent time understanding their own sexual functioning. They tend to have better knowledge scores about their anatomy and about their sexual response. They feel more confident in their sexuality, and they feel more confident about the practicalities, about being able to have an orgasm or to help another person have an orgasm while they're engaging in sex. They also report, in contrast to both gay men and heterosexual men, doing more emotion work in their relationships, so more maintenance, emotional maintenance in their relationships. So talking to each other about the relationship and dealing with some of the intimacy building stuff that goes into maintaining those relationships. It's not been found that there are clear, I think we've talked about this in someone's discussion question in class, there aren't those kind of stable stereotypical roles of type of lesbian like butch and femme, and there's no kind of connection between those patterns, like the butch person playing the male role in the sexual encounter or the femme person playing the female role in the sexual behavior. Again, it's a mythology that's based on a heterosexist, heteronormative image of penile vaginal sex, which is not applicable to lesbian sexual relationships. What these women also report is that their sexual behaviors have been fluid, meaning lesbian women have often have had a history of having sex with men, even prior to having developing a relationship that's committed and long-term with a woman. They may have even been married in the past and had satisfying sexual interactions with their marriage partner, or been in a long-term committed relationship with a man. Sometimes this involves, a slow awareness of their sexual orientation, their level of attraction to women, so that's what your authors mean by fluid sexual behaviors. The model, the last slide, your authors talked about the model being, or the formula being sex first. What lesbian women report in surveys and interviews is that they're looking to fall in love with someone first, to acquire that kind of intimacy and level of trust prior to a sexual encounter. Now, you should take both of those findings, the idea that males, whether they're gay or straight, put sex first followed by love, and that women put love first. There's actually, between those two groups, males and females, there's way more overlap than there is distinction. It's just that on average, women are more likely to prioritize having intimacy and affection and commitment first over sex, whereas men on average, whether they're gay or straight, are likely to prioritize sex over intimacy and affection, at least early stage in relationships. Lesbian couples are also reported to be more role flexible, as opposed to rigidly adhering to traditional masculine and feminine roles. They report defining roles in really fluid ways, with the tasks that are usually taken care of around a household. There's always the joke about men do the outside chores, women do the inside chores. Lesbian women report, we just divvy it up based on who has skills and interests in what areas. And if we both hate the task, we split it up, that kind of thing. So they're less rigid in terms of gender role assignment of certain tasks, one task over the other. Now, as I've said already, we know much less about bisexual and pansexual relationships. There are a lot of reasons why people would be hesitant to becoming a participant in such research. We've talked in class about kind of the double stereotypes and double stigma faced by bisexual people, which I'm guessing could be, you could wrap in pansexual people there as well. What little we know is that bisexual relationships, or I think you should probably retool that, your authors call it the heading bisexual relationships. It should be relationships where at least one person is bisexual, or identifies as bisexual. Researchers have tried to start this work by saying this is a distinct sexual orientation, because that's not always been assumed to be the case. What has been found is that people who strictly identify as heterosexual or strictly identify as homosexual report that they are often uncomfortable becoming romantically involved with someone who identifies as bisexual. There seems to be a stereotype that people who are bisexual or pansexual will cheat, that they will need to have their sexual needs met by someone else who fits that other part of the person's sexual identity, when in fact, for bisexual and pansexual people, they're looking for the same things in relationships that everyone else is, regardless of their sexual orientation. Most people who identify as bisexual or pansexual report they want stable, loving, committed relationships. Full stop. As a result of some of these stereotypes, There has been some research that shows that people who identify as bisexual report some mental health outcomes that are, on average, more problematic than people who are either heterosexual or homosexual. Part of that is minority stress, and a lot of it has to do with stereotyping and mythology around the bisexual orientation itself, and assumptions, often wrong-headed assumptions, about this sort of mythological predatory nature of people who are bisexual. Media representations of people who are bisexual are often negative, and involve depicting people who are very dysfunctional and in some cases predatory in their sexual behaviors, seeking to abuse or consume people, just using sexuality as a tool. The actual research tends to show that that's false and mythological. Pansexuality is a relatively new concept. It's not a new thing, but it's a new concept in the literature. Both men and women who identify as pansexual and are in relationships either as themselves a pansexual person or someone who's in a relationship with someone who identifies as pansexual, they tend to report high relationship satisfaction and high sexual satisfaction. At the same time, there's been some reporting of a fairly significant percentage of female participants in research looking at pansexuality who report some degree of sexual dysfunction, and that research is ongoing. It's something that's going to need to be clarified because it's hard to interpret that kind of finding. Some have argued that maybe people who are experiencing sexual dysfunction, especially females, maybe their sexual dysfunction is because they're still searching for how to understand their sexual identity. And some of that goes with that stereotype that people who identify as bi or pan are just confused. And that is a stereotype. It's a myth. So the research is really going to have to catch up here and clarify what's the meaning of this finding that some specific percentage of female participants report more dysfunctions, despite the fact that men and women report high sexual satisfaction in pan relationships. Now from there, your authors transition into a discussion of bigger picture issues and concepts. Sorry, I keep being distracted by noise on the street. One of the pitfalls of doing home recordings of lectures. Try to focus. Your authors introduce some concepts. I've added a couple. You have to kind of keep straight in your mind, and if some of you are sociology students or comm students, you may have run into these concepts already. You have to think about there are ideological level concepts that we have to understand, there are system level concepts, and then there are behavioral level concepts. Heterocentrism is ideological. So American culture, you spend an evening watching television, even though we have more representation than we have in the past, it's very clear we are still a very heterocentrist culture. We tend to use the baseline relationship model is straight, is a heterosexual relationship. So that's ideology. That's kind of what is perceived as normal, what is perceived as normative in a given cultural system. Then there's heterosexism. So in the organisms that your culture is made up of, so in the housing system, in the school system, in the religious system, in the government system, is there heterosexism? Again, in American culture, even today, there are still quite profound differences in treatment between heterosexual people, especially in their formal relationships, and homosexual people. Housing discrimination, employment discrimination, banking discrimination, all kinds of heterosexism is evident. Also, criminal justice system biases, especially if you include the broader LGBTQIA and so on. Trans people, for example, face a great deal of heterosexism in their everyday lives and face a great deal of discrimination in the criminal justice system as well. Then at the behavioral level, what we see, homophobia is roughly equivalent to personal racism or personal sexism. When individuals show homophobic attitudes or homophobic behaviors, they are personally expressing dislike and up to hatred and disgust of people who are not heterosexual. That can go from everywhere from just privately held negative attitudes but not hurting anyone directly to overt hate crimes against others. Now, you could take the example of a person who posts homophobic rants on Twitter. That's manifestation, that's homophobia. Now, if Twitter doesn't create a rule that says homophobic rants that include threats of violence are wrong, that's a systemic heterosexist decision. Now, I'm not saying Twitter did that. I have no idea if they did, but that would be a system. And then if the whole culture of people who are watching the Twitterverse, if they're kind of okay with it, that's ideology. That's heterocentrism as well. So we have to keep our eye on all three of these levels of analysis when we think about prejudice. So heterosexism, as I've mentioned, it's beliefs that heterosexuality is normal or that it's superior. And often the justifications for that are moral justifications, social justifications, emotional and behavioral justifications. I'm sure you've all heard at least one example of each of these. At a societal level, heterosexism can involve systematic applications of unfairness and stigmatization that, it can be based on particular behaviors or patterns, but also on the kinds of relationships that are seen as permissible or appropriate. The outcome of heterosexism is overt prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice in psychological terms is an attitude. It's a statement of attitude. If you say you hate gay people, that's heterosexist and homophobic. Discrimination means you're actually taking action to treat people differently. So if you're an employer, you may say, you know what, you're a gay guy, I'm not going to hire you. Or you see a gay couple and you're a landlord, you're not going to rent to them. Or you have rules about no unrelated men as roommates, or unrelated women for that matter. Those would be discriminatory outcomes. Basically, heterosexism assumes that people who aren't straight are in the wrong because heterosexual people are normal and homosexual people are not. Now, a couple of other concepts that have emerged in the decades, in recent decades, are the concept of homonegativity versus homophobia. Homophobia is kind of a constellation of negative emotional responses. Sorry, my chair. That are directed toward people who are homosexual, and it includes an aversion. So not only do I feel negative attitudes towards people who are gay, but they disgust me and I want to stay away from them. And these are surprisingly not predicted by having had any actual contact with another person who is in fact homosexual. Now, homonegativity is a set of responses, and that can include a whole cluster of emotions, fear, disgust, anger, as well as negative thoughts and negative actions. So homophobia is a term that psychologists often use just to describe a constellation of negative emotions. So that's the emotion component of homonegativity. When homophobia is embedded into a whole set of anti-gay behaviors and thoughts, then you have a person whose kind of orientation to gay people is homonegative. So in other words, you can be homophobic or have negative attitudes towards gay people, but you don't engage in behaviors that are overtly discriminatory in your everyday life. So there's a difference there between privately held negative attitudes and actually exhibiting hate-filled homonegative behaviors. So where does homonegativity and homophobia come from? In American culture, there are lots of sources. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Your authors do a fine job of covering this territory for you. But just rest assured, at every level of culture, in every kind of organizational or institutional level in our culture, there is a history of homonegativity or homophobia. Now, American culture isn't alone in that. Certainly there are many, many cultures the world over where gays and lesbians, bisexuals and trans people, and so on, have been the target of negative belief systems, negative attitudes, and negative behaviors. Now, I pulled some data. I pulled some data from the Pew Reports through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and this is data from 2017, so it's in need of being updated. But one of the things that I found useful about this information to present to you, and this is not from your textbook, is asking people who are LGBTQ about their experiences as members of our culture. So when asked if they'd experienced various forms of individual discrimination because of their LGBTQ status, over half said they had experienced threats or non-sexual harassment. So I just want you to get your head around the level. So more than half of people in this survey reported that they had been threatened in a non-sexual way. So they'd been physically or verbally threatened because of their LGBTQ status. Just over half had been victims of sexual harassment, and just over half had been victims of actual violence. Now, you should be troubled by those numbers. About 34% reported verbal harassment or being questioned in a bathroom. So, think about how vulnerable you are in a bathroom anyway. Now, some of you may not have felt that way in a bathroom, but for people who are LGBTQ, the bathroom is often a scary place. You have walls, you have no windows, you don't have escape routes. I know many women, regardless of their sexual orientation, when they're in the public sphere and they're in bathrooms in bars or in restaurants, the bathroom can be an interesting place and not always a friendly one. For LGBTQ people, depending on how they present themselves in the world, it can be a place where they get harassed. If you're a trans woman, for example, but you use a men's room, you may be presenting as female, but you walk into a men's restroom, or vice versa. You're presenting as female, but you have various characteristics that may be interpreted as male. Going to the bathroom, whichever bathroom you choose, can result in verbal harassment. Now here, what's the percentage of LGBTQ Americans saying they have experienced individual discrimination because of their sexual orientation or gender identity? More than half, 57%, said they had experienced slurs, and that number is based on, they experienced slurs due to their sexual orientation, their gender, or their gender identity. About half, 48%, said it was due to their sexual orientation, and about 24% based on just their gender or gender identity. Those who reported insensitive, offensive comments, so homophobic speech primarily, or negative stereotyping, the numbers are pretty much the same. So if you include all three, if you include sexual orientation, gender, and gender identity, over half had experienced those kinds of things. If you just are segmenting out sexual orientation, about 40% report that, and then just on gender and gender identity, about 29%. Now in this question, they looked at differences in experiences by all LGBTQ people, people of color who are LGBTQ, and people who are white. And here you see the intersection of race and LGBTQ status. And what you see is just evidence of double discrimination. When you're looking at the numbers for all people who say they've been discriminated against when either applying for jobs or interacting with the police, you see the rates for people of color who are also LGBTQ are much higher than they are for LGBTQ people in general, and even higher still for people who are white and LGBTQ. So what you see there is the intersection between race and ethnicity and sexual orientation, gender identity, and it's another example of double discrimination. So people of color are already discriminated against when they are applying for jobs and when they're interacting with the police. When they are also LGBTQ, you just kind of have to add on to that effect. Now in this chart, what they found was, and they were asking LGBTQ Americans their perceptions of which is the bigger problem, discrimination based on individual prejudice or discrimination at the societal or system level. And people tended to report, about 43% reported that they were more troubled by individual prejudice, but not much lower, about 33% were more troubled by systemic. So, that goes back to the fact that people who are LGBTQ experience both of those. So about 23% reported that they saw both as equally troubling. So you have to take into consideration the diversity of experiences that people have about those problems. And here, this was a graphic that was included with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation report on the attitudes and experiences of LGBTQ people. They wanted, just to give a snapshot of state laws that have restrictions on teachers and staff talking about LGBT issues in school. So, and sometimes students, they say, are you kidding me? There are states that do that. And I'm like, yeah, there are still some who do that. So basically, you have kind of this band across the South with the biggest state in terms of territory being Texas. But you have this band, sometimes it's called Bible Belt South, but I don't think it's necessary to add a label. But you have sort of the conservative New Mexico, Utah space, and across the South, where we still have a number of states that are restricting teachers from having conversations with their students as a part of their curriculum about LGBT issues, including in government classes. So talking about rights and responsibilities as well. Now we've talked about this a little in class, and it was prompted by your own discussion questions, so kudos there. Your authors talk about biphobia as a special, not special, that's the wrong word. It's just that you need to give special attention to biphobia in the context of talking about homophobia, because there does tend to be kind of an added dimension of misunderstanding, stereotyping, mythology attached to bisexuality or pansexuality. So basically biphobia is fearful negative reactions toward people who identify as bisexual. Interestingly, bisexual men report being viewed more negatively, and some studies of heterosexual people report that individuals are much more suspicious of bisexual men actually just being gay men who are passing part of the time for nefarious reasons. So bisexual men do tend in survey and interview studies to be viewed more negatively than bisexual women. However, I've seen trends in the media lately where you have lots of images of bisexual women, especially in the superhero genre or in action adventure film and television, of bisexual female characters who are depicted as alcoholic or troubled or damaged or having had a history of sexual assault and sexual violence. And these characters are often presented as being very, very attractive to men, but still engaging in sex when it's convenient with women. Frequently, the stereotype among heterosexuals and even among lesbian women and gay men is that they're really just homosexual, but they haven't decided and they need to get off the fence. So the biphobia, you have stereotyping coming from the heterosexual world, but also from the LGBTQ world as well. And so it's seen as double discrimination. Some studies have found that lesbian women exhibit greater hostility and attitudes towards people who are bisexual. That research is limited in the number of studies, so it will have to continue to be investigated over time. But it probably has something to do with concern, worry, anxiety about who is identifying as females, but also as males, as being attracted to women and what their motives are, what their goals are. Again, the stereotype among some individuals who are gay or lesbian is that these people are really just gay, but they're confused and they need to decide, which is a wrong-headed kind of assumption to make. Now, your authors kind of conclude and wrap up the chapter by wanting to point out that heterosexism and homophobia are negative for everybody for a variety of reasons. There are heterosexual people who are victims either purposefully or inadvertently of hate crimes. When you are bringing harm to people because you see them as belonging to a group that you don't approve of, it hurts everyone. You can think of concrete examples like a shooting in a dance club in Florida. Not all of the people who were injured in that club were LGBTQ. Sometimes they're friends, they're straight friends, just happen to be bystanders. Or there are people who are mistaken for being gay or lesbian and are harassed or injured by hate crimes as well. Being concerned, being fearful for your family members who are LGBTQ and your friends who are LGBTQ is a negative outcome. You know, when you have people that you care about a great deal and they are subject to prejudice and discrimination, it hurts you too. And that's, you know, why a lot of people who see themselves as allies, they really push hard to make the world a better place for their loved ones. Also, some theorists have argued that having this sort of homophobic, heterocentric mindset can also, it's been found to be correlated with feeling restricted in your own capacity for intimacy and expression that breaks out of heteronormative restrictions. So if you're seeing yourself as being, you know, really kind of hemmed in by strict masculine and feminine roles within your relationships, the argument has been made that if you adhere to those roles, you're going to lose something in the translation and it will hurt you. So homophobic scripts and what your authors are referring to there are relational but also social scripts for our expectations about what people should do. Like last night, my husband and I were watching, I don't know, I think it was Star Trek Picard. Doesn't matter. But a commercial came on where little boy, adorable little boy, he's in dance tights, he's in a dance studio, and he's sitting against the wall. He's kind of unhappy. And then he pulls out a Rice Krispie bar, and it's one of the Rice Krispie bars. Somebody can write a little happy message on it. And I forget what the message said, but it was like, go get him. And the kid eats his Rice Krispie bar and gets out there and goes dancing. And it's a ballet studio. Now, homophobic scripts would say a boy who wants to do dance is not a good thing. I can laugh about it now, but when, say, one of my siblings, who is male, he was very concerned when one of his sons asked for, as a toddler, a tea set. It's like, my son will not have a tea set. I'm like, why not? Because it's a girl toy. Those are homophobic scripts, as well as, princess stories and stuff like that can also be homophobic scripts. Or assigning the gay character as being the sidekick in a story. And don't get me started on that. It would take too long. One of the other things, sorry about the typo there. I'll fix that before I publish this. There's also the possibility of, the outgrowth of heterosexism and homophobia is the fact that, people can become perpetrators of and victims of various sexual offenses. Basically, having a heterosexist and homophobic orientation encourages the types of activities among young people. And, researchers have often focused on young adolescent men because they tend to be more likely to perpetrate homophobic, hate crime types of behaviors in their social interactions. These sorts of mindsets can actually encourage people to start engaging in sexual activities before they are ready in order to prove their masculine heterosexuality, and that can be very problematic. So, for example, in a high school, if you have very heterosexist, homophobic norms, boys, knowing that those are the norms, may start pressuring middle school boys and early high school boys to prove that they're straight, to prove that they're real men by having sex with girls. That can, kind of have a cascading effect where people will end up harming other people and harming themselves as a result. So how do we reduce these kinds of effects? Your authors discuss, and I'll be concluding with this, that there are a number of models out there for reducing anti-LGBTQIA prejudice and discrimination. One of those models that has been investigated in, I wouldn't say a lot, but has been investigated, especially in the K through 12 environment, is the ally development model of having people in a fairly systematic way educate and then kind of bring into the movement, if you will, people who identify as heterosexual but see themselves as committed to reducing the level of LGBTQIA prejudice that surrounds them. And we're seeing this being deployed more and more often in colleges and universities, and we're seeing acceptance levels increase in colleges and universities as well. We're also seeing pressure. Usually this is student-driven, which you should pat yourselves on the back for that, to really kind of dig in and say, what part of our curricula are really hiding some heteronormative expectations and assumptions. For example, when I work with student researchers, there's always that moment you're writing your survey and you're saying, we need to get some demographics here. How do you present the question of what's your gender? Do you ask what's your biological sex? Do you ask what's your biological sex at birth? the fact that we're asking those questions now has exposed a heteronormative fact of the way we, conduct even the simplest aspects of research. So I've talked for far long enough. That'll conclude our discussion of part 2 of chapter 10. I'll see you in the next installment. Take care.